You have been chosen, not asked, not invited, chosen. At 6 years old, a priest pointed at you in a crowd, and from that moment, your life belonged to Rome. The selection. The Pontifex Maximus walked through the streets of Rome looking for girls between 6 and 10 years old, girls born to free Roman citizens, with both parents still living, no physical defects, no speech impediments. You fit every requirement. When his finger landed on you, your father could not refuse. No Roman father could. Refusing the Pontifex Maximus was not a legal option. It was barely even a thought anyone permitted themselves to have. Your mother wept. Your father held himself rigid, the way Roman men did when they needed to appear unmoved by something that was destroying them from the inside. You did not fully understand what was happening. You were 6. You knew only that important men in white robes were speaking about you in serious tones, and that the world you had known was shutting behind you forever. You were taken to the Atrium Vestae, the house of the Vestals, a complex of rooms and courtyards that sat beside the Temple of Vesta in the Roman Forum. It was large, well-appointed, and absolutely nothing like home. That night, in a small room with a perfectly made bed, you cried until you had nothing left. The first years. Your training lasted 10 years. This first decade was the hardest, not because of cruelty, but because of loss. You lost your family name. You lost inheritance rights. You legally ceased to be your father's daughter and became a ward of the state. In Rome, that was not a small thing. Roman identity was tied to family in ways that went down to the bone. Cutting that cord changed who you were at a fundamental level. The eldest Vestal, the Virgo Vestalis Maxima, became your authority figure, your teacher, and in some ways, your mother. She was not warm in the way your actual mother had been. She was efficient, precise, and deeply serious about the work. She taught you that the work was everything, and the work was fire. The sacred flame in the Temple of Vesta was not a symbol, it was the literal heartbeat of Rome. Romans believed that as long as the flame burned, Rome would endure. Your primary job, the most important job in the entire city, was to keep that fire alive. You learned the rituals, the prayers, the exact movements required at the altar. You learned which woods burned correctly and which would produce the wrong kind of smoke. You learned how to read the fire itself, what different colors and behaviors meant, what the gods might be communicating through the behavior of the flame. You also learned to bake. The sacred salt cake, the molla salsa, was made only by Vestals and used in religious ceremonies across the city. You ground the grain, mixed the salt, shaped and baked the cakes, according to formulas that had not changed in hundreds of years. The repetition was intentional. Repetition was protection against error. The privileges. Rome gave you things most women could not imagine. You sat in the front rows at gladiatorial games, theater performances, chariot races. You had your own reserved seats, better positions than most senators. When you walked through the streets, lictors walked ahead of you clearing the path. If a condemned criminal happened to cross your path on the way to execution, he was pardoned immediately. Your presence alone had that power. You could own property, you could write a will, you could give legal testimony without a guardian present. In a society where adult women routinely needed male guardians to conduct any legal business at all, you operated with a freedom that was genuinely extraordinary. Wealthy citizens competed for the honor of having a Vestal witness their important documents. You were invited to state banquets. The emperor knew your name. When you traveled, you rode in a covered carriage, and officers of the law were required to make way for you. None of these privileges were yours personally. They belonged to what you represented, but you lived inside them every day, and after a few years, you began to understand why women before you had chosen this life when they had the chance to walk away from it. After your 30 years of service, you could leave. You could marry. But most did not. Most stayed. You started to understand why. The rule that held everything together. Chastity was not one rule among many. It was the entire foundation. Roman theology held that the purity of the Vestals was directly connected to the safety of Rome. The flame and the vow were two expressions of the same thing. An untouched fire, tended by untouched women. This was not metaphor to Romans. They believed it literally. Every military victory, every good harvest, every year the city did not burn or flood or fall, was connected in Roman minds to the Vestals maintaining their vows. You carried that weight. All 6 of you carried it together. The punishment for breaking the vow was burial alive. This was not a rumor. It was written law. The city could not shed Vestal blood, because that itself would be a kind of sacrilege, so the method was designed to be technically indirect. You would be sealed into a small underground chamber with a lamp, a little bread, a little water, and a bed. The entrance would be filled in. Rome would officially grieve, and you would die in the dark. The punishment for the man involved was public flogging to death. You knew this before you took the vow. Every girl chosen knew. It was part of the education. Transparency about consequences was considered a form of mercy. The years pass. By the time you were in your second decade of service, you had settled into the life in ways you could not have predicted as a child. The rituals that had felt foreign were now second nature. You knew the calendar of sacred duties with complete fluency. The parentalia in February, the Lemuria in May, the Vestalia in June, when the inner sanctuary was opened for women to bring offerings barefoot, while the sacred donkeys wore flower garlands and rested from their work for a full day. You had friendships among the other Vestals. Not all of them were close. You were 6 women from different families, selected at different times, with different personalities forced into permanent close quarter, but you understood each other in ways that no one outside the Atrium Vestae could. You had all given up the same things. You had all accepted the same weight. There was a senator you saw at official functions. He was careful never to single you out, but across crowded rooms, at banquets where you sat in your place of honor, and he sat with the other senators, you became aware of each other. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. It became something. How it happened. It did not happen in a single moment of recklessness. That is the part that is hardest to explain. You did not lose your mind or abandon your judgment all at once. You made a series of small choices, each one feeling manageable in isolation, each one building towards something that was absolutely not manageable. He found ways to be present where you were present, not in inappropriate settings, not in ways anyone would notice. Romans were sophisticated about appearances. He began to be someone you knew, and then someone you talked with, and then someone you trusted, and then something more than that. You told yourself for months that what you felt was simply respect, admiration, the normal human experience of finding someone's mind worth engaging with. You were not without self-awareness. You knew what you were telling yourself. You told it to yourself anyway. The actual physical reality of what happened between you was brief and frightening, and nothing like the elaborate romantic stories that some later writers would construct around Vestal scandals. It was 2 frightened people making a catastrophic decision together in a moment when fear and feeling were pulling against each other, and feeling won. Afterward, you both understood that everything had changed and nothing could be taken back. The weight of knowing. You did not confess. You told yourself you would never confess, that the secret would stay between the 2 of you, that you would carry it privately and return to your duties, and perform them with the same precision you always had. The flame did not know. The gods, you told yourself, were watching many things. Perhaps they were not watching this particular moment. You performed your rituals. You baked the salt cakes. You maintained the fire. You sat in your place of honor at public events and accepted the deference of the crowd, and you carried what you knew inside you. Not concealed, exactly. Carried. The other Vestals did not know, or they suspected and said nothing. Among 6 women living in close quarters, it was difficult to hide changes in behavior entirely. You became quieter. You slept less. One of the older women looked at you once with an expression you could not read and then looked away without speaking. Weeks passed. Then months. And then someone talked. The accusation. It might have been a slave who saw something. It might have been political. In Rome, accusing a Vestal of breaking her vow was a tool that got used for reasons that had nothing to do with actual concern for religious purity. When a politician wanted to destabilize a rival, destroying anyone connected to that rival was a proven method. When the political climate turned dark and the people needed a reason for recent misfortunes, a corrupt Vestal was a convenient explanation. The accusation came to the Pontifex Maximus. An inquiry was opened. You were not permitted to simply deny it and walk away. An inquiry had its own momentum. Witnesses were called. The man involved was identified. He was interrogated. And the questioning that came with that interrogation was designed to produce answers. You were placed under guard in the Atrium Vestae while the process unfolded around you. The other Vestals moved around you in that careful way that people move around someone who has become a different category of person, not unkindly, in some cases, but differently. The Virgo Vestalis Maxima came to you alone one evening. She sat across from you in silence for a long time. She did not ask if it was true. The way she sat told you she already knew. She told you that she had seen this before, over her decades of service. She did not say this with cruelty. She said it with the exhaustion of someone who had watched the machinery of Rome operate long enough to know exactly what it would do next. She told you to prepare yourself. The trial. Roman trials involving Vestals were public in a way that most trials were not. The city paid attention. People who would not have known your name 2 months earlier now knew it in connection with this accusation, spoke it in the forum, debated it over dinner in ways that had nothing to do with who you actually were as a person. The Pontifical College conducted the inquiry rather than the regular courts, which was a distinction that mattered procedurally but not in terms of outcome. The evidence was presented, the testimony was given, the accused man had already been sentenced pending the outcome of your trial. You testified. You had decided before you entered the room that you would tell the truth. Not because you believed the truth would save you. You no longer believed anything would save you. You told the truth, because after months of carrying the secret and watching it hollow out your sleep and your peace and the person you had been before, you had nothing left to protect except the small dignity of being honest when it finally, absolutely mattered. The inquiry concluded. The verdict was what it was always going to be. The sentence. They did not drag you. There was no spectacle of violence, no crowd jeering in the streets. The procession to the Campus Celeratus, the accursed field near the Colline Gate, was conducted with a kind of terrible formality. You were carried in a covered litter so that no one would be able to say they had witnessed a Vestal harmed in public. Priests walked ahead. The city watched from the sides of the road in silence. The chamber had been prepared. It was small. The Romans had done this before and they knew the specifications. A lamp burned inside. A small amount of food and water had been placed there. A bed was present, as required. These provisions were not kindness. They were the mechanism by which Rome maintained that it had not technically executed you. You descended the steps. You had thought about this moment many times in the weeks since the verdict. You had considered various ways of moving through it. Dignity, defiance, prayer, grief. In the actual moment, you felt something much simpler and harder to name. You felt like yourself, standing in a small room, holding a lamp, knowing exactly what was about to happen and having no power left to change any of it. The entrance was sealed above you, what Rome believed it was doing. This is important to understand. Rome did not consider this execution a punishment in the standard sense. In Roman religious thinking, a Vestal who broke her vow had already set in motion divine consequences that had to be addressed. The burial was not about revenge or deterrence, though it served both those functions in practice. It was understood as a ritual act, a correction to the order of things, a way of allowing the earth to reclaim what had been violated. The Pontifex Maximus who signed the verdict was not, in his own self-understanding, a man who had just ordered someone killed. He was a man who had managed a religious crisis with proper procedure and appropriate gravity. This distinction between what Rome told itself and what actually happened in that small underground chamber is not a minor distinction, it is the center of the thing. Institutions that believe they are performing necessary corrections rather than committing acts of violence are more dangerous and more durable than institutions that know exactly what they are doing. The other Vestals who broke the rules. You were not the first. The historical record of Rome preserves other names and other stories. Tuccia was accused of breaking her vow and proved her innocence by carrying water from the Tiber in a sieve, a miracle that satisfied the inquiry. Whether the miracle genuinely happened or whether the political calculus shifted and the accusation became inconvenient is a question the sources leave carefully open. The Vestal Minucia was accused and condemned in the early Republic, and the sources describe her as having dressed too elaborately and spoken too freely with men she encountered at public events. Whether the accusations against her were real or the result of her having made powerful enemies is not recorded. In 216 BCE, after the catastrophic Roman defeat at Cannae, when the city was searching for explanations for why the gods had allowed such a disaster, 2 Vestals were condemned. One was buried alive. One took her own life before the sentence could be carried out. The timing of those accusations, coming immediately after the military catastrophe, tells you something precise about how Roman religious machinery operated under pressure. Domitian, the emperor who ruled toward the end of the 1st century, prosecuted Vestals multiple times. Some historians believe he was genuinely concerned with religious propriety. Others believe he was using the accusations as a tool for political control, that the women chosen for prosecution were selected for their connections to his opponents rather than for any actual violation. The name that comes down through the sources most vividly is a woman accused under Domitian who maintained her innocence until the end. She descended the steps into the chamber and then paused, and her clothing caught on something at the edge of the entrance, and the escorting priest offered his hand to help her. She pulled away from it. She would not have a man touch her even in that moment. She arranged her own clothing and descended into the chamber alone. Whether she was guilty or innocent, that gesture has been remembered for 2,000 years. What it meant to be a Vestal. The institution lasted roughly 1,000 years. From the early kings of Rome through the Republic and the Empire, the Vestals maintained the flame with very few confirmed interruptions. When the flame did go out accidentally, Romans recorded it as a terrible omen. A Vestal who let the flame die through negligence rather than impurity was punished by flogging rather than burial. The gradations of consequence mapped the gradations of transgression with great precision. The Vestals were the only female priests in Roman state religion. They were the keepers of official documents, of wills, of sacred objects, including what Romans believed to be the Palladium, a statue of Athena that Aeneas had supposedly carried from Troy, and that was thought to protect Rome as long as it remained in Vestal keeping. Whether the object in their care was genuinely the Palladium or a copy, or simply a very old statue with accumulated significance, did not functionally matter. They kept it. Rome continued. When Christianity became the dominant religion of the empire, the Vestals were among the last institutions of the old religion to survive. They outlasted most of the other priesthoods by decades. In 394 CE, the Emperor Theodosius finally extinguished the sacred fire and disbanded the college. The last Vestals walked out of the Atrium Vestae and into a world that had stopped seeing them as sacred. Some of them were old women by then. They had no obvious place to go. The institution that had defined their entire existence had been dissolved around them, and the world outside had changed so thoroughly that nothing in their training had prepared them for it. The thing that does not change, what you chose, or what happened to you, or what was done to you, depending on how the particular history gets read, was always a collision between a person and an institution. The institution was enormous. It was backed by 1,000 years of precedent and the full weight of Roman religious and civic life. It was connected in the Roman imagination to the literal survival of the city. It had survived wars and fires and civil upheaval and the transition from republic to empire and the rise and fall of emperors. You were one person. The institution processed you as institutions process people who break their terms, efficiently, procedurally, with the full armor of self-justification that institutions always carry when they are doing things they have decided are necessary. And yet you are still here in the sense that matters, which is that people are still reading about this, still thinking about it, still trying to understand what it was like to be inside it. Not the institution, you, the person inside the institution. That is the strange endurance of these stories. Rome is gone, the flame is out, the Atrium Vestae is a ruin that tourists photograph and walk past. But the question of what it felt like to be the girl chosen by a priest in a crowd, or the young woman watching fire and becoming aware of a senator across a banquet hall, or the prisoner descending into a small underground chamber holding a lamp while the entrance was sealed above her, those questions do not go away. They are not historical questions. They are human questions wearing historical clothing. What to take from this? History tends to be written around institutions and events. The dates, the legal mechanisms, the political consequences. What gets compressed or lost in that process is the texture of experience for people moving through those structures in real time, making decisions that seemed survivable from the inside, even when they were not, living inside systems so large and so old that questioning them felt like questioning the ground beneath your feet. The Vestals were not a footnote. For 1,000 years, they were the religious center of the most powerful city in the Western world. They had more legal independence than almost any Roman woman. They were honored and visible and essential to the functioning of Roman public life, and the same institution that elevated them enforced its terms with absolute and final severity. Understanding that combination, the genuine privilege and the absolute constraint existing within the same structure at the same time, is not purely a Roman story. It is a pattern that shows up across human societies in different forms, in different centuries, wearing different institutional clothing in each era. The Vestals held Rome's fire for 1,000 years. The institution that gave them power also held the right to seal them underground if they stepped outside its boundaries. That is a very old tension. It did not end in 394 CE, when Theodosius extinguished the flame, and maybe that is why this story still lands in the gut. Every era invents its own sacred jobs, its own untouchable rules, its own polished language for obedience. Every era also pretends those rules are eternal, right up until they collapse. The Vestals stood at that exact fault line for centuries, revered in public, monitored in private, praised as symbols, punished as bodies. Rome called that balance piety. You and I might call it something else, but we cannot call it rare. If you want to keep exploring the lives of Roman women who navigated these systems on the edges of what was permitted, there is a great deal more to look at on this channel. These are not simple stories. They do not resolve cleanly or point to easy conclusions. That is exactly what makes them worth sitting with. Rome is ancient. The pattern is not. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next.